Hi, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live series on the release of the ISM Report on Business. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm a senior writer and copy editor for Inside Supply Management. That's Institute for Supply Management's member publication. We're excited to have you with us today. Our focus is on the March Services PMI. The composite index was a little lower than many expected at 51.4%, but that's still growth for the 15th straight month in the sector that makes up almost 90% of the U.S. economy. New orders growth pulled back. Supplier deliveries were faster, in fact, at a record level, which we'll discuss later. Employment stayed in contraction and prices growth. And remember, that's not prices levels, but the rate of prices growth hit a 4-year low, which, of course, if you're watching interest rates, that will be of great interest to you. So there's lots to talk about. So let's bring in Anthony Nieves. He is the chair of the ISM Services Business Survey Committee. Tony, good to always talk to you. Just give me your thoughts on the data today. I know in the context, the semi-annual report that ISM puts out in December discussed that growth would slow a little bit in the first quarter. I mean, is this consistent with what we're seeing? And is the rate pretty much about what you expected, or is it a little bit better or worse?
Well, I think it's come in, when you look at the composite index, yes, it pulled back a little bit, but overall, we're still seeing incremental growth month over month. And as I said earlier today with during many of the interviews, that anything above 50 is good. And that we have, come to expect some high rates of growth, especially coming out of the pandemic. We saw a little slowing back a little over a year ago in December of 2022. And since then, we've seen this steady pattern of growth for the services sector. To your point, when you look at what comprises the composite index, and it's equally weighted across 4 indexes, what's pulled this back has been employment and supplier deliveries. To your question about where do we sit today in comparison to what our respondents projected for the semi-annual, they said that the first half would be a little sluggish and that the second half would be better. So, and all indications are that we're actually in a better position than what was initially thought as far as coming out of the gate, especially post-holiday. We didn't really have that historical lull that we would see as in the past. Things have been getting more aligned to what we have seen historically, but still, this services sector has been very resilient.
Yeah, talk about that. I mean, I know you always traditionally say the first couple of months of the year, it's a typical post-holiday lull for the services sector. Is the way things are going, as you kind of mentioned, is it an encouraging sign and possibly a sign of really good things to come when you consider that summer is coming and vacation? That means vacation season, kids out of school, and people tapping more into services.
Definitely. And, speaking further to the post-holiday lull, we had traditionally or historically had seen the services sector slow down a little bit after the holiday buildup, and it would start to really see growth again in the latter part of January, getting into mid-February. And what we saw over this course of 2024 and coming out of 2023, our composite index back in December of 23 was barely over the 50 baseline. And then we popped up in January to 53.4. Then we went to 52.6, a little pullback in February, and again in March. Now, we've had some impediments, whether it be weather-related, logistics, different things that have caused some bit of headwinds, yet really did not overall impact the services sector. Again, I can't emphasize enough, we keep seeing this steady incremental growth. If you think about it, with employment, if that picture was a little different and the efficiencies in the supply chain weren't as strong as they are right now, we would see a higher composite index.
Well, yeah, let's talk about a couple of the indexes that specifically that you mentioned pulled down the composite. Employment is one of them, and the reading was 48.5%. That's close to a break-even point, not quite there. And you got some questions earlier today suggesting that really didn't mesh with the ADP private payrolls report that came out. I believe the number was 140,000 that they showed had a gain, but it kind of explained how that index works. And I'll also point out, while the index was in contraction, we asked our survey respondents how many, percentage of their companies added staff in the month as opposed to reducing. And I'll point out that in March, that number was higher among the respondents that said their companies added staff. It went up to 19.1%, down up from 13.5 in February. So just kind of explain how that works and, how it doesn't really contradict other indexes or other reports.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you hit the nail on the head. We're measuring two different things here. We're measuring directional change with a diffusion index versus just what is an increase in jobs in the payroll report, 140,000 jobs versus we're looking at asking our respondents, did you have higher or better, the same or less? So when we look at that, and our respondents are indicating, to your point, we had 6 industries that added jobs last month. We had 7 that were unchanged month over month, so they didn't lose jobs, and we had 5 that had contraction. So in essence, again, we're measuring the change. We're not necessarily measuring just the jobs they added. And so they could have added jobs month over month. It was just less than they did the previous month. So hopefully that provides some clarity to our listeners. But overall, the employment index, as you said, it's just below the baseline. I think that it still continues to be a mixed bag. I've been saying this for several months, and our respondents indicate that, one, they still have difficulty backfilling positions depending on the industry. Certain industries we know for a fact have not hired. In fact, they've been laying off jobs, and we see that in the tech world, information industry. And then you look at real estate. Real estate is another one that's been flat for several months because we know interest rates have impacted the growth for that sector or that industry within the sector. And they are the largest contributor to GDP for this sector of services. So again, one thing that I found very interesting from one of the respondents is that even though business activity was up and they still were showing strong business, that they weren't hiring. They were taking a cautious approach to hiring. And again, I keep saying I don't like to be redundant, but the single largest variable expense to manage for service industries is labor. It's labor intensive. And so that's what they can control. The fixed costs are what the fixed costs are.
Yeah, you had mentioned that in an earlier interview today about, a lot of businesses being cautious about hiring. Is that how services businesses are in general, would you say, or is that kind of just a reaction to the a post-pandemic mindset? We're not going to race back and hire as quickly as we can, or are services businesses generally that conservative when it comes to hiring?
It's a combination. I think that we've seen from COVID and coming out of the pandemic, it's been very hard for companies to recruit certain positions, the more labor intensive, tedious service type positions that you would see in accommodation and food services. People are trying to work less hours. There's still many that indicate that there's a preference for working in some kind of hybrid environment or maybe remote or continue to work remote. And then you look at, again, traditionally for services companies, you have fixed administrative costs that you can't get around. But then there's other variable payroll that is associated or correlated directly to whatever your services that you're producing, and staffing is correlated to that. And for my background in hospitality, you see that in restaurants and hotels and how they staff according to shift and according to volume, to occupancy, or to cover count in a restaurant. And same thing in retail, depending on what time of year they're going to overstaff because they need it based on the activity levels. So it is that expense that's managed, and it's something that they can literally take off of their top line of their expenses there right away.
Yeah. Well, let's move to the other index that had an impact on the composite. That was supplier deliveries. And I know we've explained in this space before that that index, it's the only ISM report on business index that's inversed. So that means a lower number is going to indicate faster deliveries. A higher number will indicate slower deliveries, which is typical as demand goes up and the economy improves. So that's why it's inversed, or one of the reasons it is. This was we discovered today, it was the all-time lowest reading for the supplier delivery index, 45.4%, all the way going back to 1997 when ISM began tracking that data. That's great for faster deliveries. Everyone wants to get their stuff faster, but it does pull down the PMI when, the index is in faster territory. So just, explain that dynamic. And, was that a little bit of a surprise that, the index was a record?
Well, for it to continuing to be faster deliveries, yes, that's a little bit surprising, especially at that rate. I think as we get into the warmer months and less logistical, we'll start seeing more increased demand. And that's one thing we should point out is that when there is increased demand and strong business activity, you will see slower deliveries and slowing of deliveries. And that is why we look at this index as being slow deliveries is actually a good thing. Everyone wants their stuff faster, but when things are slowing, that means the economy is really humming strong, and it's causing both slowing deliveries as well as potentially backlog. And you see a fluctuation in inventories of being replenished and depleted. But, back to the supplier deliveries itself, interesting enough, pointing out that our respondents indicated, even with the challenges in the Red Sea, as well as the Panama Canal with the water levels for the locks, that has not posed any challenge to the efficiencies of the supply chain. The other thing to mention that's on the forefront of everyone's mind is the bridge being destroyed over in the inner harbor of Baltimore. Too early to tell how that's going to impact the supply chain. That happened right at the tail end of the month, literally was at the morning of the 26th of March. So we won't see the remnants of that. I think we're saying somewhere between 20 and 30% of containers flow through that particular area. And I think it'll be up to how expeditiously they are able to clear that channel. More importantly, besides the obvious of lives being lost, the 15,000 jobs that are impacted in that particular area. So hopefully that has some resolution and gets rectified sooner rather than later. And overall, I think that when we're looking at these supplier deliveries, I anticipate that, and again, don't have the crystal ball, but I think as the weather gets warmer and we start seeing some increased activities in some of these industries, that we'll start seeing the delivery slowing. So I don't anticipate it staying down at that record level of 45.4.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot that services is especially dependent on overland trucking. And our counterpart Tim Fiore over on manufacturing, when he kind of talked about the potential disruptions from the Baltimore bridge collapse, he said, trucking might be impacted a little less than other modes of transportation. It's like maybe an hour or two detour or so. Talk about that dynamic of it. Do you expect that to be a headache for the services sector? And also, it's a prices dynamic that needs to be considered when you talk about trucking. Just talk about that, the importance of that for services businesses.
Yeah, I think fortunately for that particular area, there are alternate routes. So it's not water or landlocked per se. But it's more about port of entry for the container ships. And I think there's just alternate routes that can be taken, but it will be a slowing effect that we'll see from that. So I think overall, as it relates to trucking, again, how does it impact trucking? I think the biggest concern for overland trucking right now is fuel costs. Okay. And we see the price of oil, they're projecting maybe 20 to 30 increase per barrel. That'll have a big impact on cost. And whether it comes into play as far as actual product cost or fuel surcharges, which we're all too familiar with, I think that that will affect the total cost of ownership for products and services. So we'll have to keep an eye on that in the next upcoming months, especially as we project the demand to increase.
Yeah. Well, we kind of talked about, the prices and as how far as it relates to trucking. I mean, let's go into it in general. I mean, the prices index in March registered 53.4%. That's a 5.2 percentage point decrease. And that's the index's lowest reading, since March of 2020. And as we emphasized, that doesn't mean prices are at their lowest level. It means that the growth is at its lowest level in about 4 years. So just, was it kind of a surprise considering manufacturing had a little bit of an increase? And of course, everyone wants to know what that means about interest rates. I think Jerome Powell is speaking possibly right as we are recording this right now. So everyone's going to be paying attention to what he's going to be saying. But just talk about, the ISM indexes numbers have always been part of that discussion on interest rates. Just, give us the lay of the land as you see it today.
Well, it's such a big category to really look at as far as prices, because a lot goes into it. When you look at the services industries, the tangible goods aspect comes from the manufacturing providers upstream, and they are more susceptible to quick change in market conditions as they're tied to global markets and commodity prices and dealing with raw materials. So sometimes you'll see a cycle time that lags a bit for services as it relates to pricing outside of things such as fuel. I mean, that's just an immediate impact. But when you're looking at finished goods, and in certain instances, you see some of the cost being absorbed through the supply chain before it hits the services. So it's not like every single increase has an immediate impact to the services industry and the companies that comprise those industries. But overall, to your point, Dan, you said pricing is still increasing. It's just at a slower rate. Our respondents told us directly in their comments that, yes, they're seeing some stabilization, but they're still concerned. There's still a little bit of uncertainty surrounding inflation, and has been pointing out numerous times in the press about shrinkflation, right? We're seeing the packaging has changed. I first noticed it during COVID, just my own personal observation going to the supermarket, to the grocery store, and seeing the change in packaging and availability of certain labels. And that was all based on production and capabilities and capacity constraints. But now when you look at it today, it's become the norm to combat the consumer psyche of having to deal with such huge spikes in pricing. And because we've seen, especially in food commodities, how volatile pricing has been over the course of the past few years.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about it. I know you've always, discussed a lot, the manufacturing sector. Obviously, it has a big impact on services, as you like to point out a lot. Products and components in the manufacturing sector wind up as finished goods in the services sector. So the fortunes of the manufacturing sector are always going to have an impact on services. As you know, the manufacturing PMI went into expansion for the first time. I believe it was 18 months. Just discuss that impact, and what it could have on the services sector.
I'm just happy that they've gone into expansion territory. It's about time. I was getting a little frustrated there. I was telling Tim he had to pull his weight and hold up his end of the bargain here.
Yeah.
It's just, it's nice to see. That is, as we've known for many years, that manufacturing is the bellwether. They usually indicate early on when we're going to hit a recessionary period or we're coming out of a recession. And it's nice to see this. And Tim's been saying it for quite some time that we're going to see this growth in manufacturing. And I kind of was lulled into complacency waiting for it. And it was really nice to see it pop up like that.
Yeah. One of the questions that I had for Tim, he referred to it as an oddball contraction. There were dynamics, obviously, post-pandemic that made it a little bit different and maybe a little bit more frustrating to look at than past manufacturing contractions. One of the questions that I asked for him on Monday is that, were there any lessons to be learned? I guess I'll kind of repurpose that as a question for you. I mean, obviously, services is makes up a greater percentage of the economy. And during that, that time that manufacturing was in contraction, well, the mindset was, well, services can carry the economy for a while. Just talk about that dynamic. What did you learn? Have we learned anything about the resiliency of the services sector during that time that manufacturing was in contraction? And, what lessons can we take for the economy moving forward?
Well, it's really they're interdependent from one another, but yet they're joined at the hip. Not to contradict myself, and so it was interesting to your point. I would always say, look at the largest contributor to GDP. It's services. It's eclectic. It can weather fluctuations better, similar to a diverse stock portfolio. But the challenge remains that it's still, again, a contributor and a catalyst for the overall economy. So we need manufacturing to do well. That's an obvious statement, but I mean, it's more so in the sense of, we know that even though the component of the economy of where it is, it's still providing jobs, it's still providing products. And more importantly, when you look at it in totality, it's also on our reliance on if we're seeing this manufacturing keep dipping down, what's the end all for that? Do we continue to offshore and outsource, or where does it go? I think that hopefully we keep seeing this trend of growth for manufacturing, and that'll bode well for the services sector.
Yeah. Tim also made a good point the other day. He had described the manufacturing data kind of as a look in what it might mean for the economy, say 6 or 9 months from now. And he really had high praise for the services data. That's more of a current snapshot of the current economy. Just to kind of expand on his point a little bit and just talk about when you kind of compare and contrast the two, kind of use the two, just the value that the ISM report on business data provides in terms of taking that snapshot of the U.S. economy.
Well, you look at it as I was just sitting here thinking through things, and there's certain production items that we have on the manufacturing side that can't be rivaled anywhere else. And there's certain things that we produce, and you look at the refineries and chemicals and some of the other categories that comprise manufacturing. It's not only efficiency, but it's also quality. And then it's also what it associates and correlates to in services, and what's derived from services based on those manufacturing industries. Now, to your question, the key thing is cycle time. We are very much demand pull. So it's hand to mouth on the services side. You see shorter cycle times. You can look at the new orders index and see that the cycle time for services is a lot shorter than producing or manufacturing an airplane, right? It's going to take months, if not years, to produce something on the manufacturing side. So that's why when I said earlier about it being the bellwether, and you can see activity on that side is actually what's going to happen down the road. Whereas, as Tim pointed out, that services is now. It's really short term. Where you might see some lengthening of things might be in future engagements on the management of companies and support services, or professional, scientific, and technical services in that kind of arena. But for the most part, everything else is a direct demand pull.
One thing that I had just remembered to bring up until now, I mean, we've been discussing on some of the work that I've been doing for our magazine, just where inventories are at this point post-pandemic, and whether that might necessitate a shift back to JIT, that model, where will it be a more sophisticated JIT, where there are some instances where companies will prepare to have extra safety stock that maybe they didn't have during the pandemic. And obviously there have been a lot of eyes on our inventories index, and a lot of companies are right sizing there. In the services sector, I know that's a very big thing in healthcare, as companies are starting to right size their inventories for some of the pandemic supplies and stocks that they had. Just talk about inventories in the services sector. I know not every services sector company measures them, but just talk about maybe some of the adjustments that might be going on there.
And you look at inventories, and certain companies say they don't measure them. Doesn't mean they
Mhm.
don't have them, right?
Yeah.
You see many companies shift, especially if they're not producing anything. They will shift toward using their inventories as stock levels, but they become direct expense. So it's
Mhm.
not like they have to. It's still about cash liquidity because you don't want products
Mhm.
sitting on a shelf. Rule of thumb is that your inventory value, 25% of it is carrying cost for maintenance, and it's just sitting there and how it impacts your cash flow and, with interest and everything else. But when you look at it, it's like services I always like to be a little funny when I talk about services and inventory. There's a difference. You mentioned just in time
Mhm.
versus just in case, right?
Mhm.
Uh, just in time or demand pull versus fly by the seat of your pants, right? So
Mhm.
you see in services industries that they're less reliant on inventories depending on the companies and the industries that they're in. But again, it's still about cost management. It's strategic cost management. And so when you see inventory buildup, again, the economy is humming along really strong and people need to anticipate their business requirements. So they build up their inventories. Depletion of inventories can happen in two instances. One being that product's not getting there fast enough and the demand is great, or they're managing their costs. So it's just a matter of, and again, you have to look at it on an annualized basis and not just on a month over month basis for certain companies.
Yeah. Well, hey, Anthony, this has been great. A great overview of an important month for the services PMI. I mean, that's all the questions that I had. I mean, is there anything that we haven't discussed or that I haven't asked that you think might be important to note in regards to this month's data?
Well, I think overall,
Mhm.
as always, Dan, you do a great
Mhm.
job covering the reports on business, and it's
Mhm.
especially not being a practitioner and having to deal with both manufacturing and services. It's you do a really fine job, and I can tell you that when you look at these reports and what's most important about them is that there are people that work across various industries that comprise these two sectors, and they're giving us information quicker than what you can get from most other areas. So uh, appreciate everything, and
Yeah.
thanks for having me on the show this morning.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, we appreciate it. Tony did mention our survey respondents and how they contribute to the report. And I believe, yep, there it is. You can, if you want to be a part of our panel, go to ismworld.org / join the panel. Don't forget the hyphens there. And yeah, it takes on, you can do it anonymously. It takes 10 minutes or so. And you can be part of the panel that contributes important data that measures real-time information on the state of the U.S. economy and of the manufacturing, services, and hospital sectors. So thanks for joining us today. Yeah, for more information, go to ismworld.org, where in a little bit you can read our roundup article that details a lot of what Tony and I have discussed here, as well as how the markets are taking the data today. And we'll see you back here in a month's time when we break down the April ISM report on business. So for Anthony Nieves and some good people who helped us behind the scenes today, Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens, my name's Dan Zeiger. See you next time.